Collectively, we've played hundreds of hours of Kingdom Death Monster, and we just finished a full base game campaign, so it's the perfect time to sit down and tell you 10 rules that you're absolutely, categorically going to miss when you begin, or have been, playing Kingdom Death Monster.
We're also going to do our best to try and provide you some solutions for these 10 rule mistakes that you might make, and give you our best option for counteracting them.
So the problem, potentially a solution. We'd love to hear your mistakes down in the comments below, and with that, we're going to go as quickly as possible.
Number 1 is going to be when you are either the one who is attacking the monster or you are encountering a trap, you are not allowed to use any of your survival actions. You cannot dash out of the way, you cannot dodge the hit, you have to stand there and take the hit like a big survivor that you are.
Yeah, this is one of the things that is horrible when you remember it seconds before you think that you could dodge. These survival actions can be lifesavers, but the way that I try to remember this is by playing it through thematically. I think about attacking a creature, swinging a sword, pulling back a bow and arrow. I've made myself vulnerable. Well, what are you doing in the game? You're also rolling dice. So here's the rule that you can incorporate to try to remember the fact that you cannot use survival actions if you're doomed with a trap or if you're the attacking survivor. Well, did you roll? If you rolled the dice, you're not going to be able to dodge.
Yep.
Moving on to point number 2, dice rolls specifically, and this is probably the most complicated part of Kingdom Death whenever I've tried to teach people how to play. It has to do with the little grid of numbers we have in the top corner of all of our weapons.
Your speed, your strength, your accuracy, all of these stats that you're going to have to add and subtract, they're all designated by little numbers on the side, and it is very complicated.
Now, we're not even going to start to get into the way that you add all the other numbers around. Right now, I'm just talking about those 3 numbers. Here's how I remember what they do and how I teach new players. The first number is how fast you're swinging, right? So if I'm punching you, I can get 2 punches in really quick. Well, that's Excalibur. I can take 2 swings of my sword. The second number is how likely you are to touch or hit, come in contact with the creature you're fighting. If I took 2 good punches at Shira, I'm going to miss one because she's super fast, but I'll get her on the rebound. That'll be 1 hit, right? So the likelihood of colliding. But just because I get her doesn't mean that I'm actually going to do any damage or hurt her. Well, it's the same thing here. The final number is how likely you are or how strong you are, meaning how likely you are to actually cause a wound or inflict damage with the hit. Just because you touch something does not mean you're strong enough to actually hurt it. That's how I explain it. It's still going to be confusing. Just go over that time and time again.
The third is going to be fully reading the cards. This is something I caught in a recent gameplay of Gambler's Chess specifically, so this is going to be a Crimson Croc card. It's the first time I've encountered 3 separate paragraphs on a card, and the last one is one that I don't know if I just never read it carefully enough, but it says if the 99-finger spine hit location is in the discard pile or in play, persistent injury, unresolved hit location, place it on top of the hit location deck. I have most likely done the it's a reflex, so it's going to happen no matter what, whether you fail or whether you wound. And so I have done the reflex where the monster moves or collides and it rolls, because that's on a lot of other cards. But this specifically mentioning the 99-finger spine, I only caught it in hindsight.
And the hard part here is because cards contain a variety of text, from flavor text to story to conditional responses like this one, to things like crit locations or responses. This card pulls your attention back to the game board and doesn't really encourage you to double-check the card before you finish or resolve the things you've already done, like moving creatures and colliding with your survivors on the battlefield. The way we've decided to remember this...
Leave that card off to the side. Do not put that card on the discard pile of your AI deck until you have finished reading it from top to bottom, including all the parentheses and exclamation points that might do a lot of harm for you.
Yeah, just leave the card somewhere weird. Make sure you've read it fully before you reposition it.
Even put it in the middle of the game board, because everyone who's going to be looking at the game board for the next turn is going to be noticing it.
Okay, our 4th thing that you're for sure going to get wrong while you play is going to be the traits that we have, the character personalities of all these creatures, the management that has to go into it. And this is actually really complicated because every level of creature will have a different personality that it has. And as you fight with different moods and different conditions that come out, you might have changing dynamics in the battlefield. Remembering all this for a game like Kingdom Death is really important. I'm not the person that remembers all this, though, so how do you do it?
So let's say the Butcher, for example, because the Butcher has specific cards that make you draw an additional AI or an additional 2 AI every monster turn, or it has the fast target that is going to make you reshuffle the hit location deck. So things like traits that affect the decks that I'm going to be manipulating every single turn, or drawing extra cards, or putting cards on top, I set to the side of those decks. I always have my decks right in front of me, and so if it's affecting the AI deck, I put it next to the AI deck. If it's affecting the hit location deck, I set it next to the hit location deck. Additionally, if I have any severe permanent injuries that are in play, I'll put those next to the AI deck as well, because sometimes the AI deck references permanent injuries.
The game gives you a beautiful location to keep track of all of this.
But it's sideways.
We ignore that 100% of the time.
I have all of my cards lined up on the edge of our game board, to the point that sometimes when we encounter that game board, I slide them off and then I put them back, because that's the easiest spot for me to...
So not only does it come down to where you put the cards, put it next to what is relevant and double check it every round, but on top of that, have one person control the monsters every time you play. Shiro runs this deck. I don't actually know many of the traits, the conditions, or where to place them, because I've never ran a creature when we've played together. But you also don't know how to build a lot of the gear, because that's the part that I take.
Or the innovations.
Or the innovations. So those are our two solutions. Moving on to number 5. This one's a little heartbreaking.
Number 5 is going to be Lantern 10, or critically wounding a monster. On the die, you're going to see that there's a Lantern 10. In the rulebook, it states that a Lantern 10 will always wound, just like a 1 will always fail, no matter what your statuses are.
And it's a little tricky, because it says that it's a critical wound. It's a critical hit. Like, we've done it. We attacked it, and we vanquished it.
Back to our favorite Butcher deck. If you notice that these two cards, in the Butcher deck, there is only one card that has a critical wound. It even says it on it. The Butcher is shocked. This is the only Butcher hit location with a critical wound effect, and thus the only location that can be critically wounded. If there is not a critical wound location on that card, you cannot critically wound that monster.
But that doesn't mean that you can't hurt it, because a Lantern 10 is still always a successful hit or a successful wound, even if it's insanely powerful and insanely strong. It's the way Kingdom Death gives you hope.
But there might be some gear keywords that say if you critically wound, this will not count for it if there's not a critical location on that card. Additionally, when the higher level monsters have luck, they are going to counteract that critical wound. So a 10 is actually not going to be a critical wound.
Yeah, so, alright, to rephrase this real quick. A Lantern 10 is always a wound, unless the creature has luck that negates your ability to wound it with a perfect hit. But ignoring luck, let's say you're just going head to head, it is always a wound. It is not always, however, a critical hit. A critical hit down here, or a critical wound down here, is a condition that happens beyond what is happening on the table. So not just a single wound from the AI stack, but a hamstring that's broken, or a head that's now dazed, a condition that affects the creature you're fighting. Those are different. Where does this really come into play, and what's our strategy for remembering this? You think this is the worst strategy possible? My strategy for remembering this is to throw the Founding Stone at the Butcher one time, without checking what's there with your little headband or anything like that, and then sit there as a game group and go, let's all look at what happens now. You'll probably draw a location that has no critical hit. Right? No critical wound possible. You will hit it, you'll connect, already does that. But the Founding Stone specifically says it's a critical wound. It does not result in damage. It does not result in anything.
Yeah.
You lose your Founding Stone, then you'll never forget that this exists.
Yeah, I don't like his solution. But...
Yeah, it's a great solution. Moving on down, that's
Numbers.
one of the more complicated ones to explain, I'm going to be honest.
With the luck, especially.
Moving on down to fighting arts and disorders. As you begin playing and progressing through the game, you're going to get more and more fighting arts and disorders. These are conditions, and they really do impact the characters that you're playing and how they interact with the game state, preventing them from hitting in blind spots to making it so they fall down the moment someone starts bleeding on the battlefield. They could even be beneficial things, rarely, where you can team up with other players, you can get extra attacks or double your movement from time to time. Or, like this, if you gain a disorder, you'll get your lifetime reroll back. You don't want to forget that. But you have to mix these back into their decks to keep the randomness still accurate. You can't leave them sitting next to the game board like we would prefer to do, because every time you draw from the Fighting Art deck or the Disorder deck, you need to have them all in the deck. What's the solution? How do you remember all this? Well, first, write everything down. In a notebook, on a larger piece of paper, on your own custom settlement sheets, write everything down. On top of that, you can print out little helpful cards or scan and duplicate these if you want to have them next to you. But the final thing that I recommend, and I try to do every time, is review and utilize the fighting arts that you have available. The game really changed for me when I started taking advantage of the skills and powers that the fighting arts gave me. There was one campaign particularly where we said every fighting art we get, we're going to try to maximize its usefulness with every character we take out. That's when I started to sink in just how powerful or conditional they can be.
Additionally, when you go to Gambler's Chest, you're going to have the philosophies that substitute for that, and the philosophies can make or break a showdown if you use them with all of their power.
Moving on down.
Number 7 is going to be armor status changes. So there are going to be gear in your gear grid that will say reduce damage from every hit suffered by 1 to a minimum of 1. Or when you activate terrain, you may add +2 to your rolls, or thick protective fur protects your parts, add +1 to severe waste injury roll results. There's also going to be innovations that are going to give you modifications to brain trauma or severe hit locations. You need to write these down, because a lot of times you're going to be looking at your stats, you're going to be looking at your strength, your evasion, your accuracy, and you're not going to be glancing to your gear grid with the exception of your weapon, because you're going to be activating your weapon as much. You know your armor is in place because you have your shields up, but you don't necessarily look at this. So what I tend to do is write down the modification underneath the body part it applies to. So the lion skin cloak, it's on the chest, but it's reduced damage. I write it on top of all of my locations, reduced damage by 1, so that when I'm looking to take away damage from the armor points, I see that, and I subtract it.
Now, where this really comes into play, like you said, is on that sheet. You should really have 3 categories of tracking going on your conditional stats. You should have the ones for permanent upgrades and track when and how you get those. You should have the ones for temporary upgrades, things that happen during the hunt or during the showdown specifically, or benefits you got from spending endeavors back at the settlement. And you should have things for your gear specifically. So whereas the in-game kind of character sheets give you one place to put a number, it's really not good enough, because you'll get very lost and very confused very quickly.
We end up making slash marks and have a permanent number and the gear modifications underneath. The permanent number you should also take into account when it's affected by injuries, because sometimes you can heal those injuries and you would gain back that stat modification.
Yeah, so keep track, write things down, and keep it all in one collective location. I think is our biggest tip on all of these elements.
Things like innovations that affect our whole settlement when they go out to fight. We wrote down a little sticky note of things to just look at before each fight to pay attention to, because brain trauma rolls will affect everybody.
Okay, let's talk about creatures. I brought up the fact that you're going to be confused and people are going to be confused when you try to teach them how you attack. Well, it's going to get all the worse when you start adding your numbers, creature numbers, your benefits, their benefits to this whole mix. So every time you go to do an attack, do the math. I'm telling you, do the math. Check your weapon, check your dice roll, check your player stats, check the enemy stats, and see what the calculations are. These are things that you're going to forget all the time. These are the tokens that the game provides for you to track modifiers on different creatures. And if you're moving from a level 2 to 3 or 1 to 2, you're going to be adding these every time you fight something a little bit more powerful. The cards don't change. So
you might be adding more cards, but you are going to be adding more statuses.
So this is what they all do, and I'm going to go through this quickly, but remember, what I'm advising you to do is every time run the math, or you're going to make mistakes no matter how experienced you are in Kingdom Death. Accuracy is going to be a condition that changes up or down the likelihood of you or the creature hitting the person they're targeting. We have evasion. Evasion is going to be a modifier that changes the likelihood of you or the creature hitting the person that you're targeting. They pair up like that. Evasion will be a negative to accuracy. Accuracy will be a negative to evasion. They're the opposites. Moving on down, we have toughness. Toughness is going to be a modifier determining how likely it is for you or the creature to wound the other person. It's the opposite of strength, which is going to be right here. So strength and toughness pair together. Strength is how likely you are to wound with a hit. Toughness is how likely they are to resist a hit that you're throwing at them. Moving on down, we have damage. Damage is going to be a modifier that adds or subtracts the amount of damage the enemy does to you.
There's no player equivalent of the stat. You're only doing 1 damage when you wound.
It's bad news across the board. Movement. Movement is going to be a condition that changes how far you can move. Double check that whenever you're doing a move result, because some of these creatures will either get really slow, so you can actually kite them, or they'll be exceedingly fast and you should just run away the whole time. And finally, speed and luck. Speed is how many dice you're rolling.
And be careful not to confuse it with movement, because movement and speed sound like they would be quite similar, but they're actually very much not.
They're not at all. And luck.
Luck is going to be how likely you are to critically wound.
Luck is very conditional and very confusing. If you're rolling, like you tried to explain early, a crit 10, and the creature has 1 luck in the positive sense, that's not a crit. It's as if you rolled a 9, in a way. If you have luck that modifies and lowers your potential for crit, like fighting Fist and Tooth will give you +1 luck, that means you crit on a 9 or 10.
Yeah.
The creatures can have enough luck to make it so you can never crit, and you can have enough luck to make it so that you're very likely to crit.
Yes.
Okay, so those are the statuses. It's hard, I know.
Number 9 is going to be lifetime rerolls. This is one that we have sought clarity on numerous times. The text of the card says, once per lifetime, a survivor may reroll a single roll result. They must keep this new result. First of all, a lifetime reroll can be spent by anyone in the settlement. It does not have to be spent by someone who is participating in that event. So for intimacy, someone who is not participating in the intimacy event, someone else can spend their lifetime reroll. Additionally, you can spend more than 1 lifetime reroll on a single event. If you got a really crummy result and all 4 of your survivors on the hunt have their lifetime rerolls, one after the other, you can all spend them. It might not be your wisest choice, but...
Here's the hard part. This is all we have indicating what this means. It actually has taken some BGG sleuthing and people analyzing Adam Poots, the creator of Kingdom Death's language and conversation with people to indicate what lifetime reroll means in your game. The language seems to indicate that you could interpret this, that you roll 1 dice, you don't like the result. So you roll another dice, or you re-roll that dice in particularly, and you now have to keep this result. We're stuck with a 9, or we're stuck with a 1, or whatever we get. But that's not the case. All it's saying is that if I roll a 2, and then I decide to spend a lifetime reroll, and I roll a 7, I cannot go back and choose to keep the 2. It's not that you have 2 options, it's that you've replaced the original. How do we know this? Well, Adam has talked about the settlement event, such as intimacy, and given the narrative or the flavor or the story of the game to be as if multiple people in the settlement were interacting with and stopping whatever it was that was happening, right? Encouraging the guy, a slap on the butt, or telling the woman not to walk off into the darkness, or coming in and adding medical aid and support to give birth to a good, healthy child, or potentially twins. Congratulations, you're a father. This, I know, might not satisfy some people, but it really is how this works, and this really matters because when you have really, really punishing, I've said really too many times, when you have extremely punishing moments during Kingdom Death, the power and ability for the settlement as a whole to interact is very essential. How do you remember this? Well, think about it thematically. Just like Adam Poots taught us how to play this part of the game, you can also do the same thing. When someone is spending a lifetime reroll during your gaming sessions, have them narratively involve what they're doing into the story of the game. Not only is it fun, but it reminds you that everyone at the settlement, or everyone on the hunt track, or everyone on the showdown board could change the outcome if they were to do something slightly different. It's like you're being about to be attacked by the White Lion, and you're going to have your throat ripped out, or you're rolling on the brain trauma roll, and I can see you going insane. I shout out and remind you that it's not all bad. And you look at me and you go, no. It is all bad. And then your partner, your lover, your brother, your enemy,
your child,
reminds you that there's something out there worth living for. preferably to see them die in a gruesome way later on, and you get to roll again and you get to continue fighting. Make it narrative. That's our advice. The final thing, one of the things that people maybe get the most upset about online when people misinterpret this is the rule of death. So we're going to read through this on camera with you and make sure we're all very aware of what the rule of death is. Now, for most people, they kind of just say, oh, it's rule of death. Always make it terrible for you. Always choose the worst thing. That's the rule of death. But it's not quite the case. Shira, if you want to go ahead and read through this, and then we'll break it down as we go.
Where is it? Conflicts, and the rule of death. As in any game with many moving parts and rules, conflict may occasionally arise regarding rules, interpretations, group decisions, or exceptions. First and foremost, this game is designed to provide time well spent with friends. Use this as the guiding principle for solving any problems that arise. In addition, here are some technical guidelines for resolving conflict. When conflict arises over contradictions in rules, apply specific rules found on cards, AI, gear, etc., and story events before any rules found in the rulebook core rules section.
So if we're sitting around the table and a card says something and the rulebook says something else, we don't get to choose between those two things. We're not interpreting it our own way or having an argument. The cards are the verdict. The game book we set to the side. There's no rule of death incorporated here.
If conflicts arise that slow or halt a play session completely, use the rule of death. Always rule against the survivors. Kingdom Death is a dangerous place and the survivor's future is bleak. Make sure that any ambiguities resolve against the survivor's favor. At its core, Monster is a cooperative experience. Be respectful of others as you navigate the game's decisions together.
So the rule of death, at its heart, is not about making a verdict between multiple confusing rules or clarity on cards. It's about providing a pathway for a game to go forward when you either don't have time to check the rulebook or a lot of people around the table are arguing about what should be done. In that one in particular situation, you move forward by ruling against the survivors, meaning the person that's arguing that it should be favorable, usually me, is wrong. But if you can check the rule or look up a keyword, or if it's a discrepancy between different parts of the game coming together, that's clarified. It doesn't go to the rule of death. It's where a lot of people get confused. They start fighting with people about what a card says and what the game book says and what they think should be done or what Uncle Joe taught them last week. And they rule based off of terrible things, which doesn't have to be the case.
Yeah. Those are our 10 rules. Those are things that we've messed up that we think other people might be likely to mess up, and our solutions for hoping to avoid messing those up.
Hopefully this has been a helpful video. If it has been, leave a comment down below letting us know what rules you've missed, because we might include them in a future video.
Or let us know what other rules we've missed in videos that we filmed and did not include on this list, because some people keep track.
Whatever the case, though, whatever you do, remember to do the important thing. Don't get braces, and find a throat lozenge. You're lisping and you sound a little scratchy, man.
We'll see you next time.
Bye.